The crash and first encounter. Bryce Harrington sat in the cockpit of his survey ship, eyes scanning the star maps flickering across the screen. His fingers hovered over the console, navigating through unknown sectors of space in search of new resources. It had been a routine mission, until it wasn't. A sudden, blinding flash of light filled the cabin, followed by a violent shudder. His stomach lurched as the ship's hull groaned under the stress of a catastrophic failure. The systems blared in warning, and the world outside his ship became a blur of colors, stars, and the endless void of space. It happened so fast. The ship was in freefall, spinning out of control. The screen in front of him flickered as the ship veered off course, a comet's tail of debris trailing behind them. He tightened his grip on the controls, trying to right the vessel. But there was no time, nothing he could do. The ship crashed with a bone-rattling impact, the force of it shaking Bryce's entire body. The world was reduced to chaos. Fire, smoke, and the overwhelming screech of tearing metal filled the air. His breath hitched as he fought to stay conscious, his body battered by the violence of the crash. For a moment, everything went still. When Bryce came to, he was sprawled across the remains of his cockpit, disoriented, his head throbbing. The ship was in ruins, torn apart, debris scattered across the alien landscape outside. The once sleek craft now lay broken in a rocky terrain beneath a dim, alien sun. Great, he muttered to himself, attempting to push through the pain and pull himself from his seat. Just what I needed. His ship was gone. The comms were down. His supplies were scattered. The planet around him was strange, unlike anything he had seen before. The air was thick and humid, the sky a dull gray as if the sun was struggling to break through the atmosphere. He had no idea where he was, no map to guide him, and no way to call for help. Focus, he muttered again, taking inventory. He was still alive. That was something. Survive first, think later. Pushing through the haze of pain, Bryce staggered out of the wreckage. His legs wobbled beneath him, and his breath came in short gasps. He needed food, water, and shelter, and he needed them fast. The rocky terrain was unwelcoming. Jagged rocks stretched out around him, a few twisted, alien plants scattered across the landscape. His eyes scanned for any sign of movement, and that's when he heard it, rustling in the distance. A low, purposeful sound that immediately set him on edge. What now? He whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the makeshift spear he'd fashioned from broken parts of the ship. His heartbeat quickened, adrenaline surging through his body. Moving cautiously, he approached the sound, keeping to the shadows, eyes scanning every corner. It wasn't long before he saw it, a figure entangled in the wreckage of his own ship. The figure was still and seemed to be in distress. Bryce's eyes narrowed as he approached, and the figure slowly came into focus. It was a woman, or rather, a beast woman, as the old reports had described. A creature with the body of a woman but the sharp features and power of a predator. She had sleek, white fur that was matted with dirt and blood. Her muscles were visibly taut, and her body radiated strength. But it was clear that she was trapped. The twisted metal from the crash had pinned her legs. She was struggling to free herself, but the effort only seemed to make her pain worse. Bryce's first instinct was to run. To turn around and save himself. He had no reason to help her. In fact, he had every reason to be cautious. The species was known for their hostility towards humans. The Vocari were vicious and deeply distrustful of human beings. But there was something about the way she growled, the way her eyes flashed with both pain and defiance, that made him pause. Something in him, maybe an instinct or maybe just his training, urged him to act. He couldn't leave her like this. Cautiously, he took a step closer, keeping his spear low and out of sight. Her green eyes flickered towards him, and for a split second, he saw a spark of recognition. A spark of disdain. She was staring at him like he was the enemy, like he was the very monster her people had warned her about. But Bryce wasn't about to back down. Not when there was a life to save. Easy, he said, his voice soft but firm. I'm not here to hurt you. The Vocari woman's eyes narrowed, a low growl reverberating from her chest. She strained against the debris, her powerful arms pushing against the metal, but the pain from her trapped legs made it impossible. Bryce didn't flinch. He could see the blood pooling around her legs, and that was enough to drive him forward. Slowly, he knelt beside her, carefully setting his spear down. He didn't speak for a moment, but rather, he examined the wreckage, his focus entirely on how to get her out. As he began to shift the twisted metal, her gaze never left him, sharp and calculating. He had no illusions about the risks. She could easily lash out, tearing him apart with the strength of her limbs. But as he worked to loosen the debris, he noticed something else. Her trust was slowly building. Her posture, though tense, had softened just slightly. After several minutes of careful work, Bryce finally freed one of her legs. She gasped in pain but didn't lash out. Instead, her gaze softened, just a fraction, as she looked at him. "Thank you," she rasped, her voice low but laced with confusion. "Why?" Bryce's mind raced, but his response came without hesitation. "Because you were hurt," he said simply, offering a gentle shrug. "And no one deserves to suffer alone." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at her leg and then back up at him, her sharp eyes studying him like a predator evaluating prey. It was clear she was not used to kindness from humans, nor did she know how to process it. Minutes passed in silence before Bryce took out his remaining rations, his hand hesitating for only a moment before he handed her the small packet. The beastwoman's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering in her gaze as she took the offering. Her fingers brushed his briefly, and he felt an electric jolt run through him, an odd, unexpected connection. Her green eyes met his again, and for the first time since their encounter, they weren't filled with pure hostility. There was something else there now, curiosity. She tore into the ration bar, eyes never leaving him. Bryce watched quietly, wondering if this would be enough to change her opinion about humans. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse and hesitant. "Why?" He tilted his head. "Not all of us are monsters," he replied simply. "Some of us help when we can." The tension between them hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no aggression, no hate, just two survivors on a strange world. The Vocari beastwoman's gaze softened just a fraction, but her wariness remained. She had accepted his food, but trust wasn't something that could be earned in a moment. "Leilani," she finally said, her voice quieter now, almost unsure. "I am Leilani." "Bryce," he replied, offering a small nod. "Nice to meet you." As the sun began to dip below the alien horizon, the two of them sat in silence, side by side. Neither of them spoke, but the shared experience of survival had started to form an unspoken understanding between them. The journey ahead was uncertain. Dangerous. And neither of them knew where it would lead. But for the first time, there was the flicker of something more than just survival between them, a shared humanity, despite the odds stacked against them. And it was only just beginning. Reluctant allies. Bryce awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the distant call of strange alien creatures echoing in the air. The strange, silverish light of the planet's twin moons filtered through the narrow cracks in the rocky alcove they had found the previous night. His body ached from the crash, but the pain was a dull background hum, something he could endure for now. What truly weighed on him was the silence between him and Leilani. She had yet to speak after their brief exchange. Her sharp green eyes, full of suspicion and unreadable thoughts, followed his every movement. It wasn't the typical hostility he was used to seeing, but it wasn't trust either. It was something in between. Something fragile. The fire from the night before had burned low to a few glowing embers, and the makeshift shelter they had huddled beneath was now a cold, eerie place. Bryce rubbed the back of his neck, still uneasy about the unexpected connection they had formed, but also aware of the deep chasm of misunderstanding that still separated them. "Morning," he muttered, though it felt more like an awkward truce than a greeting. Leilani didn't respond at first. Instead, she shifted her weight carefully, her ears twitching slightly as if listening for something beyond the alcove. Her white fur was still stained with dirt and blood from the crash, though it seemed that at least some of her strength had returned. "We should move," she finally said, her voice rough, but carrying an undeniable authority. She sounded like someone used to giving orders, even if those orders weren't for him. "The predators are getting closer." Bryce blinked, instinctively reaching for his spear, though he hadn't yet had the chance to sleep enough to feel fully rested. "Predators," he echoed, glancing toward the tree-line where dark shapes seemed to move just out of sight. "I thought we were the only survivors." Leilani's piercing gaze turned to him, and for the first time since they'd met, there was something softer in her eyes, something almost compassionate. There are always others, she said cryptically, standing to her feet with a fluid grace that was both unnerving and impressive. You're not the only creature on this planet who's hungry. Bryce swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't sure what kind of creature she was referring to, but he didn't need much imagination to know they wouldn't be friendly. Leilani, despite her injury and the uncertainty of their situation, clearly understood this planet far better than he did. All right, he said, gritting his teeth. Then let's get moving. Without waiting for his response, she stalked toward the opening of the alcove and stepped into the dim light, the grace of her movements almost predatory. Bryce followed, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. In this hostile world, they were bound by survival. They moved quickly through the alien terrain, carefully picking their way around jagged rocks and alien plants with sharp, thorny tendrils. The air had a strange, metallic scent to it, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift occasionally, as if it were alive. Where are we going? Bryce asked after a while, his voice carrying just enough urgency to cut through the tense silence. Leilani didn't immediately answer. She was focused, her eyes darting to every shadow, every rustling in the distance. She had stopped several times to listen carefully to the sounds in the forest, her sharp ears twitching with each new noise. You're asking the wrong question, she finally replied, her tone colder than before. The question isn't where we're going. It's what we're trying to avoid. He frowned, but didn't press her for more details. Leilani clearly wasn't the type to share her plans with anyone, especially a human she'd just met. All he could do was follow her lead and hope she had some kind of plan. Several hours later, after navigating through dense patches of alien flora, the sun began to set. The air was thick with humidity, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to weigh on Bryce's chest. He had no idea how long they had been walking, or if they had even made any progress at all. It was hard to judge the passage of time when the sky above was a strange mix of grays and pale blues, with no clear distinction between day and night. Leilani finally stopped, her ears twitching as if she heard something Bryce couldn't. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. We rest here, she said, dropping down to the ground and leaning against a boulder. We'll need to be ready. Bryce didn't argue. He was tired, his limbs sore and his mind exhausted. The strain of trying to navigate both the planet and Leilani's unpredictable behavior was beginning to take its toll. He sat beside her, still unsure of the exact nature of their alliance. Ready for what? He asked, his voice low. Leilani glanced at him, her sharp green eyes narrowing. There are creatures here, she said, her voice tinged with a strange mix of wariness and authority. They're not just beasts, human. They're intelligent. They can track us, and they know how to hunt. The hairs on the back of Bryce's neck stood up. And you know how to stop them. Her lips curled slightly, though the expression held no humor. I know how to survive. That's all that matters. Bryce let out a breath, his thoughts momentarily interrupted by the quiet buzzing of insect-like creatures fluttering in the underbrush. There was something eerie about the way the alien wildlife moved around them, almost as if it was observing them rather than fleeing. It was then that he heard it, the faint, guttural growl coming from deeper within the forest. His heart rate spiked as he turned to Leilani, who was already standing, her posture tense. Stay close, she ordered. And keep quiet. Bryce's instincts kicked in, his hand reaching for his spear. He didn't know what was out there, but he could tell by the look on Leilani's face that it wasn't something he wanted to encounter. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound from the trees, a low, ominous sound that only grew louder. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. A massive creature, at least 10 feet tall, with dark, armored skin and glowing red eyes. It was covered in scales, with claws sharp enough to tear through metal. Its growls reverberated through the air, and its eyes locked onto Bryce and Leilani with a ferocity that sent chills down his spine. Stay behind me, Leilani hissed, her own posture shifting into one of readiness. She wasn't afraid, not like he was. But Bryce had never seen anything like this before, and the fear that gripped him now was all-consuming. The creature advanced, its growl deepening as it neared. Leilani didn't move. She stood her ground, her sharp eyes calculating. And then, with a sudden, brutal movement, she lunged. The next few moments happened in a blur. Bryce's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Leilani strike with unmatched speed, her claws slashing through the air, her body a blur of white fur and raw power. The creature roared, swinging its massive arms in an attempt to swat her away. But Leilani was quick, too quick. She darted in and out, landing strikes on the creature's armored hide, her movements precise and efficient. Bryce stood frozen, his grip tight on his spear, unsure of what to do. He had no idea how to fight something like this. But one thing was clear, he needed to help. He hesitated for a moment longer before charging forward, his spear raised high, aiming for the creature's exposed underbelly. Just as he closed the distance, the creature swung its massive claws in his direction, and Bryce barely managed to duck, feeling the wind from the swipe brush past his face. In that moment, he realized, Leilani was right. Survival depended on them working together. Bryce's heart raced as he lunged again, spear in hand, but this time, he didn't hesitate. As Leilani distracted the creature with another powerful strike, Bryce drove the spear into its side, hitting a vulnerable spot beneath the creature's scales. The creature let out a deafening roar, stumbling back as it swiped at the air in pain. With one final, furious snarl, it retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Breathing heavily, Bryce stood next to Leilani, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. They were alive. But just barely. That was close, Bryce said, his voice hoarse. Leilani didn't reply immediately. Instead, she simply watched the shadows, her posture still tense. "We're not done yet," she said softly. "Not by a long shot." As the night fell once more, the alien planet seemed to grow even darker. The two of them sat in silence, the reality of their situation settling in. They were far from safe. But they had each other. And that, Bryce realized, was their only hope for survival. Bonds forged in fire. The stars above were dimmer tonight, their light obscured by the dense clouds that rolled across the alien sky. Bryce sat against a jagged rock outcropping, his legs sore from the trek earlier. The adrenaline rush of the battle with the creature had worn off, leaving only the cold bite of exhaustion. His eyes flickered toward Leilani, who was sitting a few feet away, her back straight, her posture alert as always. The silence between them had thickened, like the weight of something unsaid, something unspoken. Bryce couldn't deny it, he was still processing everything that had happened. The crash. The fight. And most of all, Leilani. She was a puzzle. A riddle wrapped in mystery, wrapped in fur. The beast woman was strong, capable, and terrifyingly competent. Yet, she was also something else, a survivor, a fellow wanderer in a strange land. She wasn't just a savage, as many humans might have believed. She was more than that. "We need to move out before dawn," Leilani's voice broke through his thoughts. It was firm, a command rather than a suggestion. She glanced over at him, her green eyes gleaming in the dim light, still unreadable. "The predators aren't the only threat here. Others, like us, will be looking for shelter too." Bryce nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood what she meant. He had only been on the planet for a short while, and the intricacies of its dangers were still beyond him. "I'm ready," he said, forcing himself to sound confident. Leilani didn't respond immediately, instead turning her gaze back to the dim horizon, scanning the dark expanse with a predatory focus. He could see her lips tighten slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing as if anticipating something that wasn't yet visible. He watched her for a moment longer, before deciding to break the silence with the one thing that had been bothering him. "You didn't tell me much about what happened to you before I found you in the wreckage." She tensed at the question, her body stiffening as though bracing for something. When she spoke, it was with a cool edge that made it clear she wasn't eager to discuss her past. "It doesn't matter," she said curtly. "I'm here now. That's all that matters." Bryce leaned forward, shifting slightly so that his weight wasn't entirely resting on his back. He knew better than to press her too hard, but there was something in the way she said it, something she wasn't telling him. He had been through enough to recognize when someone was hiding a part of themselves. "It matters to me," he said quietly. "We're stuck here together. If we're going to survive this, I need to know what I'm up against. You're not alone anymore." Leilani's eyes flicked over to him, a flicker of something, a mixture of surprise and perhaps something softer, crossing her face. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "You're a fool," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "I've been alone longer than you could ever understand. And trust is earned, not given freely." Bryce could feel the weight of her words, but he didn't let them deter him. Then let's start earning it. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant rustling of the wind and the low hum of alien insects. Then, she stood up, her movements fluid and graceful, the muscles of her body rippling beneath the fur that still clung to her frame. "If you're going to keep talking," she said, her voice suddenly softer, almost gentle, though her sharp gaze never left him. "You should start helping." Bryce blinked in surprise. "Helping?" She nodded, reaching into a small bag of supplies she had salvaged from the crash. "You'll want to be prepared if we're going to keep moving. There's no shelter here. No more food either." Bryce rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his clothes. He followed her without question, though part of him felt the unfamiliar sensation of her trust in her simple request. It was small, but it was something. They worked together in silence, gathering what they could from the wreckage of Bryce's ship. The metal pieces were scattered in jagged heaps across the rocky terrain, making it difficult to navigate the area. Still, they managed to salvage some of the basic supplies, a few emergency rations, a water filter, and some makeshift tools that could prove useful if they found themselves in a jam again. As they worked, Leilani's eyes remained watchful, constantly scanning the surroundings. Bryce couldn't help but admire her focus. There was a sharpness to her that was almost intimidating. Every movement she made seemed purposeful, every decision measured with the precision of a soldier, even though she had never mentioned anything about military training. "You've done this before," he remarked, half to himself. Leilani paused, her gaze lingering on him for a moment. There was a flicker of something, maybe recognition, or maybe even a trace of respect. But again, it was gone too quickly to be certain. "Surviving is the only skill that matters on this planet," she said, almost in a whisper, before turning back to the wreckage. "And yes, I've done it before." Bryce didn't ask any more questions. He knew better than to push her too hard for answers. But in the silence, the unspoken bond between them seemed to grow just a little stronger, a little less uncertain. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pale blue and orange, they had gathered enough to keep them going. Bryce had no idea where they were heading, but Leilani seemed to know the terrain far better than he could have imagined. "We're going to the mountains," she said as they packed their belongings. "It's safer there. If we're lucky, we'll find shelter before nightfall." Bryce followed her without hesitation, even though he knew that luck had nothing to do with their chances. The world they were on was hostile. Every creature, every shadow, every gust of wind could be another threat waiting to pounce. But for the first time since the crash, Bryce felt something like hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. They made their way toward the mountains, the sky above beginning to brighten as the day wore on. But there was still a long journey ahead, one filled with uncertainty, danger, and perhaps even more surprises. Leilani kept a steady pace ahead, her movements deliberate. As they climbed higher, the wind grew colder, and Bryce's breath fogged in the air. The landscape was changing, alien trees giving way to rocky outcrops and sparse patches of grass. Despite everything, despite the fear and the exhaustion, Bryce couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something big. Their fragile truce, the tenuous bond they were building, he knew it could shatter at any moment. But for now, it held. And that was enough. The path ahead would be long and dangerous, but it was a path they would walk together. The beast woman, with all her strength and her scars, and the human who had chosen to trust her, despite the world around them. "Stick close," Leilani said as she glanced over her shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings once more. "We're not safe yet." Bryce nodded and fell into step beside her, feeling the weight of the journey pressing down on him with every step. Together, they would face whatever came next. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would both learn something about trust along the way. The choice between survival and sacrifice. The mountain range loomed ahead, its jagged peaks piercing the dim sky, each one a testament to the harshness of this world. The wind had grown colder as they ascended, whipping through the rocky paths with unrelenting force. Bryce's breath came out in visible puffs, his legs burning with the strain of the climb. His body ached from the hours of trekking, but Leilani's pace remained steady, her movements swift and purposeful as if the rugged terrain were no challenge at all. Bryce couldn't help but marvel at her resilience. She had been through so much already, he'd seen it in the way she moved, in the way she barely flinched when they had to keep going despite exhaustion. It was as if the idea of stopping, of resting, was foreign to her. But Bryce, despite his training and survival instincts, found himself struggling to keep up. "You're not used to this, are you?" Leilani's voice broke through his thoughts. She had slowed her pace slightly, glancing back at him with an expression that almost looked like amusement. "Almost." Bryce shook his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Not exactly. But I'm learning. Slowly." She raised an eyebrow, her green eyes flickering with something akin to approval. "You're tougher than you look. Not many humans would last this long in the wilds of this planet." Bryce chuckled weakly. "Yeah, well, you're the expert here. I'm just trying to keep up." Leilani didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back toward the mountain, her face tightening as if the thought of their destination weighed heavily on her. The tension between them was palpable, and Bryce couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. They hadn't spoken much since the incident with the creature, a massive, scaled beast that had nearly torn through them. Bryce had no doubt that Leilani was still processing the danger they had narrowly escaped. The silence stretched between them, and Bryce couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her than the fierce warrior she presented. She had a history, a past, one that she wasn't ready to share. And he didn't know if he ever would. Yet something in his chest made him want to push for answers. But he knew that pushing too hard could break the fragile bond they were starting to build. By the time the sun began to dip behind the mountains, they had found a sheltered cave nestled between two large boulders. It wasn't much, but it offered protection from the wind and a place to rest. Leilani immediately set about creating a small fire, gathering dried plants from the surrounding area, and using her skills to turn them into a quick, efficient fuel source. Bryce sat nearby, his back against the cold stone wall, watching her work. There was something calming about the way she moved, about the way she handled the task with such confidence. It reminded him of his own survival training, but her grace was different. It was instinctual, something forged by years of living in a hostile environment. She glanced up, catching his stare, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. Neither of them said anything, but in that moment, Bryce felt the unspoken understanding pass between them. They were both here because of choice and chance. He had saved her, and she had kept him alive. There was a mutual respect between them now, something more than just the need to survive. "It won't be much longer before the storm hits," Leilani said, breaking the silence again. "We'll need to stay put until it passes. We don't want to be out there when it hits." Bryce nodded, glancing at the horizon. The clouds had darkened, swirling ominously as the storm approached. He wasn't sure what kind of storm they were dealing with, but from the way Leilani's expression had tightened, he knew it wasn't anything to take lightly. "How bad is it?" Bryce asked, his voice low. "Bad enough." Leilani's tone was grim. "The winds can strip the flesh from bones if you're exposed for too long. And the creatures," she trailed off, shaking her head. "They're not a concern if we stay here, but if we venture out." She didn't need to finish the thought. Bryce could imagine the dangers. This world was full of them. It was a miracle they'd made it this far, but it was clear to him that their survival was still far from guaranteed. The hours passed slowly. Bryce sat by the fire, fiddling with his equipment, trying to distract himself from the gnawing hunger in his stomach. His rations had run out, and though he was too proud to admit it, he knew that they needed to find food soon. Leilani had eaten earlier, a small portion of what they had left, but she hadn't spoken much since. She was lost in her thoughts, and Bryce didn't want to interrupt. Eventually, she broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't belong here." Bryce blinked, turning to look at her. The firelight danced in her eyes, casting shadows across her sharp features. There was something vulnerable about her in that moment, something raw. She wasn't just the warrior now, she was the woman who had been through something far more painful than he could imagine. "I'm starting to think I don't either," Bryce replied softly. "But it seems like I don't have a choice." She turned her head, eyes narrowing as she studied him, her gaze unwavering. There was a flicker of something, perhaps recognition or perhaps something else, but it was gone too quickly for Bryce to grasp. "You always have a choice." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Bryce didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what she meant, but it felt like a challenge. A challenge to both of them. She stood up then, her movements swift and decisive. "I'm going to scout. Stay here and keep the fire going." Bryce didn't argue. He knew better than to question her instincts. She was strong, capable, and knew this world better than he did. But as she slipped into the shadows of the cave entrance, Bryce couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something was coming, and they were both walking right into it. The night stretched on, and Bryce couldn't sleep. The sounds of the storm outside were deafening, the howling wind and crackling thunder echoing through the cave. He sat awake, listening to the fire crackle, the only source of light and warmth in the growing darkness. It wasn't long before he heard the faintest rustling near the cave entrance. He stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon at his side. "Leilani," he called quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a pause, and then the silhouette of the beast woman appeared in the dim light. Her movements were graceful, almost predatory, as she stepped into the cave. "There's a settlement nearby," she said, her voice low. "But they aren't friendly. We need to be careful." Bryce's heart skipped a beat. He had been hoping for some form of help, but the idea of encountering other survivors was both a blessing and a curse. "How far?" he asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. 2 days' journey. "But there's something you need to understand," she added, her eyes locking onto his. "These people, they won't trust you. They'll see you as a threat." Bryce stood up, his pulse quickening. "Then we'll have to make them trust us." Leilani gave him a rare, sharp smile, though it was filled with something darker. "Trust is earned here. But it's not always worth the price." The fire flickered in the background, casting long shadows across the cave walls. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, a new storm had begun to brew. One of choices, of risks, and of the price they would both have to pay for survival. The price of trust. The morning after the storm was eerily calm. The heavy clouds that had filled the sky the night before were now scattered and thin, casting a pale, washed-out light across the alien landscape. The wind had settled, leaving the air crisp and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Bryce and Leilani stood at the mouth of the cave, staring out over the horizon. Leilani had led him here, to the edge of something both uncertain and dangerous. The settlement she spoke of was not far now, only 2 days' journey. Yet even as she gave him directions, Bryce felt a gnawing unease in the pit of his stomach. This place, whatever it was not going to offer them sanctuary. It wasn't a simple choice between safety or danger, it was a gamble. "Are you sure about this?" Bryce asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Leilani turned to look at him, her gaze steady, but there was a glint of something sharp in her eyes. "We don't have a choice. We're out of options." He nodded, though doubt still lingered. He had learned that Leilani was always calculating, always aware of the risks. But that didn't mean she had all the answers. The beast woman stepped away from the cave, motioning for him to follow. "We need to move fast. The storm's over, but it's only a matter of time before others come looking for us. And you're not the only one out here." Bryce swallowed the lump in his throat and picked up his pack. He had thought, briefly, that they might have some peace after the chaos of the storm, some time to breathe. But he had learned by now that peace was fleeting on this strange, hostile world. They began their trek across the rocky terrain, their path winding through jagged cliffs and sparse vegetation. The land here was nothing like what Bryce had expected. There was no lush wilderness, no gentle streams, no clear skies. Instead, it was barren, desolate, and unwelcoming, just like the beastwoman's people, who had once been nothing but a myth to Bryce. Now, he was seeing the truth of it with his own eyes. "You said the people at the settlement wouldn't trust me," Bryce said, his voice breaking the silence between them. "Why?" Leilani didn't look at him as she answered. Her pace didn't slow, nor did her eyes waver from the path ahead. "Humans are enemies to them. I'm not the only one who sees your kind as monsters. They've been burned before. Too many times." Bryce felt the weight of her words. The idea that an entire species would view him as a monster, just because of who he was, struck him deeply. But he understood it too. He understood fear, and fear bred distrust. He couldn't expect anyone to simply accept him. Not when the world had taught them to hate what he represented. "And you? What do you think of me?" he asked quietly. Leilani's voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the hesitation in her words. "I've seen enough to know you're not like the others. But that doesn't mean I trust you." Bryce didn't answer, his mind working over the implications of her words. Trust had always been a fragile thing for him, especially with someone like Leilani, someone whose very existence had been shaped by the violence of 1,000 years of history. Yet, somehow, he knew that her distrust was not just of him, but of herself as well. She had been taught to see humans as nothing more than monsters, but now she was forced to confront the fact that not all humans were the same. "I'm not asking for your trust," Bryce said after a moment. "I'm asking for a chance." She glanced over at him, her sharp eyes cutting through the distance between them. "A chance is all we have, now." The sun rose higher, casting harsh shadows across the rocky ground as they pressed onward. The landscape changed with each step, cliffs giving way to barren fields, then rocky outcroppings that blocked their path. The journey was slow, difficult, but they made steady progress, and with each passing hour, Bryce's sense of uncertainty grew. He could feel the weight of the settlement drawing closer, but it was not a weight he welcomed. By nightfall, they had made it to the base of a long, jagged ridge. Bryce could see the silhouette of structures in the distance, tall, angular shapes that seemed to defy the natural landscape. The settlement. Leilani stopped at the foot of the ridge, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll camp here for the night," she said, her voice firm. "Tomorrow, we go in." Bryce nodded, but his unease had only grown since they first spotted the settlement. The strange feeling gnawed at him, twisting in his gut as he realized just how dangerous this next step was. Leilani set to work gathering what little wood she could find, starting a small fire. Bryce sat nearby, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. His mind raced through all the possibilities, the worst-case scenarios, the things that could go wrong. He knew this world was dangerous, but it wasn't just the alien creatures he had to worry about. It was the people, the ones who wouldn't hesitate to see him as a threat. The ones who wouldn't care about the men standing before them, only about the monster they had been taught to fear. As the fire crackled between them, Leilani turned her gaze to him, her eyes reflecting the flames. "You know this won't be easy, right?" Bryce met her gaze, his expression steady. "I know." She didn't look away. "They won't care that you're not like the others. They won't care that you helped me. They won't care that you're human." Her words were harsh, cutting. "They'll see you as a threat. And you'll need to prove yourself. Harder than ever before." Bryce nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. "I'm ready for that. But I won't back down. Not this time." Leilani studied him for a long time before nodding. Her expression softened, just for a moment, before the hardness returned. "Good," she said. "Because this is your last chance. After this, there's no going back." That night, sleep came fitfully. Bryce lay awake beneath the stars, the wind carrying the distant echoes of a world that seemed to never stop shifting. He wasn't sure what awaited them in the morning, whether it would be salvation or destruction. But he had made his choice. There was no turning back now. The price of survival was more than just trust, it was everything. And Bryce was willing to pay it. The price of unity. The morning came far too quickly for Bryce's liking. The pale light of the sun filtered through the remnants of the storm clouds, casting long, eerie shadows over the landscape. He sat up from the fire, stretching his stiff muscles, his gaze lingering on the settlement that now stood just within reach. His stomach twisted in anticipation and anxiety. Today, they would confront their fate. Leilani was already awake, standing at the ridge's edge, her back to him as she surveyed the settlement. He had grown accustomed to her silence, the way she seemed to carry an unspoken weight. She had not shared much about her past, and he had not asked. In these moments, words felt too fragile, especially when it came to something as complicated as trust. "We move now," she said, her voice firm. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Bryce stood and dusted himself off, his pack slung over his shoulder, his spear ready in his hand. The time for hesitations was over. Whatever came next, he had already chosen this path, alongside her. The journey from the ridge to the settlement took an hour, the terrain changing from rocky outcrops to a flat, barren plain, the air growing thick with anticipation. As they approached the settlement's outskirts, Bryce could see the structures more clearly, tall, imposing towers that looked like they were built from the very rock that surrounded them. This wasn't a place of comfort. It was a fortress. A sanctuary, perhaps, but one forged through necessity, not peace. Leilani moved with purpose, her steps never faltering. She did not look back at him, but Bryce could feel the weight of her gaze, the guarded tension that clung to her every movement. When they reached the entrance of the settlement, 2 armed guards stepped forward. They were tall, armored, and their eyes were wary, always scanning, always assessing. "State your business," one of them demanded, his voice gruff. Leilani stepped forward, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I've come to speak with the council. Alone, if possible." The guards exchanged a look, but Bryce could see the suspicion in their eyes. They had no love for humans, this much was clear. Leilani's presence didn't make them any more trusting, and Bryce knew that he was already an unknown variable in their eyes. "You're not alone," the second guard said, his hand moving toward his weapon. Leilani's expression darkened. "He's with me. He's not the enemy." The tension between the guards and Leilani was palpable. Bryce shifted uneasily, but he didn't speak. The silence stretched for a long moment before the first guard spoke again. "The council will see you. But he stays outside." Leilani looked back at Bryce, her expression unreadable. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, regret, perhaps, or a lingering doubt, but it was gone before he could be sure. "Fine," she said, her voice low. "Wait here." Bryce watched her walk away, her lithe form disappearing into the heart of the settlement. He was left standing in the cold, his breath misting in the air as the reality of their situation sank in. He had no idea what awaited her inside, what decisions would be made. He could only hope that her words were enough, that her trust in him would be enough to break through the wall of hostility that surrounded them. Hours passed, and Bryce's mind wandered. He couldn't help but replay the moments he had shared with Leilani, the moments of fragile trust, the silent understanding that had grown between them. She had not been easy to reach, but the bond they had formed, however tenuous, had been forged through shared hardship. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When the settlement's gates finally creaked open, Bryce's heart skipped a beat. Leilani stepped out, her face unreadable, but there was something different about her now, something stronger, as if the weight of the conversation had shifted something inside her. She walked up to him slowly, her movements deliberate, each step carrying an air of finality. "We're leaving," she said quietly. Bryce frowned, a knot forming in his chest. "What happened? Didn't they listen?" Leilani shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "They listened. But they'll never accept you, not after everything that's happened. Not after the war. Not after what they've been through." Bryce didn't know what to say. His mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. He had come here, hoping for a chance, hoping that things could be different. He had hoped that Leilani's voice, her testimony, would be enough to bridge the divide between them. But it wasn't. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice low. Leilani looked away, staring out across the barren landscape. "We don't have a place here. Not yet. But there's a way. A chance. I've spoken with the council." She turned to face him then, and there was a strange mixture of sadness and hope in her eyes. "They're giving us one more chance. But it's not just about surviving anymore. It's about proving that we can do better. That we can find a way to coexist. And if we fail..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Bryce nodded solemnly. The stakes were higher now, but they were not without hope. Over the next several days, Bryce and Leilani traveled together, leaving behind the settlement that had been their potential salvation. They were not accepted there, but in their hearts, they had found something more important, an understanding between them, a quiet, unspoken promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And as they ventured into the unknown, they realized that survival wasn't just about finding refuge. It was about finding a way to build something new. Something that could bridge the gap between species. Something that might just allow them both to live in peace. Epilogue. Years later, in a quiet settlement on the edge of the galaxy, humans and beastfolk lived side by side. It wasn't perfect. There were still old wounds, old fears that ran deep, but the peace was real. Leilani and Bryce had worked tirelessly to build that bridge, brick by brick, proving that unity was possible, even in a fractured world. Their bond, once tentative and fragile, had grown into something strong, a symbol of what could happen when two people, from different worlds, chose to stand together. Bryce stood in the midst of that settlement, watching Leilani as she helped organize the latest supply shipments. They had come a long way from the rocky cliffs and hostile landscapes. Together, they had built something lasting, something more than just survival. They had built a future. And in that future, humans were no longer monsters. They were partners. Allies. Friends. Bryce smiled as he watched Leilani, her back to him, her head held high. We did it, he whispered to himself, knowing that the journey had only just begun.